We heard earlier about this economic inequality and the opportunity gap. And in fact, CED's report does highlight that one of the cornerstones to helping us narrow that opportunity gap is through work investing at the earliest possible time, and especially with our most vulnerable children who stand the most to gain. So we're going to talk about that today. We have an incredible panel who is doing this in different ways, and they're going to highlight what those are. I had to smile when somebody on the earlier panel talked about the zip code, and zip code matters. How many people have heard Warren Buffett talk in his most Buffett, eloquent kind of a way about the Lucky Sperm Club? So in true elegance, it is the same principle, which is, some people are born at the right place and at the right time, into families in the right conditions that live in the right places. And his idea is that just because you're a member of that Lucky Sperm Club, which he counts himself among, that shouldn't dictate where you end up in life and what your economic prosperity is. So what he did is he turned around and he gave $1 billion to each of his kids. But because he didn't want them to just be members of the Lucky Sperm Club, the idea was they had to give it all away, that was going to be their way of giving back. So as the Alliance got started as this pooled fund, Susie Buffett is our benefactor, who is now joined by 10 of her friends. But Susie started. And the short version of the story is Susie found that she had a few extra bucks in her pocket, and she had 2 sons, and they were in middle school. So she went to the middle school, and she said, hey, I have a few extra bucks in my pocket, and I wonder how I can be helpful. And she was shocked to death to hear the middle school principal say, well, don't start here. Because by the time they're in here, they're way too far behind, and I can't catch most of them up. So you got to do something way down the line. And that's how Susie got introduced to early childhood, and as she did that and wanted to impact the greatest number of kids, the way that we all would know that, and through the panel earlier, was to put it into policy. So the Alliance Pooled Fund has a way of doing this. We have a framework. The best bet policies are out there. Please note that. And we do that through our partners like Mike mentioned, CED being one of our extraordinary partners. And we want to engage all of you in this conversation too. So that's where we're going next. I think what I'm gonna do is go have each of these fine folk, who by the way could talk for hours, and we don't have hours, so I have my trusty phone up here. I said, I want you to tell everything you know in 8 minutes, good luck. So each of them are gonna tell a bit about very specifically what they're doing, which is incredible, and to tie early childhood into economic development and opportunity. And then we really will do a round at the end that leads the charge for what their peers and all of you all in this room can do. So let's start with Jeffrey Dunn. Jeff is the president and CEO of Sesame Workshop, and he has also been an incredible leader at Mattel and Nickelodeon. So you can imagine the wealth of experience that he brings in children's programming, as well as in the modern age, the use of technology as a delivery system. So Jeff, can you kind of lay some groundwork around early childhood development and learning, and then tell us how you're using some of that research that influences what we see on Sesame's programming, and we'll turn it over to you that way.
Yeah, okay, thank you. So I'm going to start with, why does this really matter to us? Why should we really care? We have been at this at Sesame for half a century, trying to help kids grow smarter, stronger, and kinder. And Joan Gansconi, who founded it, really this is something she understood half a century ago, and she was way ahead of her time. But in the idea that a picture is worth 1,000 words, and thank you to Linda here, because these slides come from her. Let's just visually take a look at what we're talking about here, because it really does, explain it. So if I'm working this correctly. Okay, so let's start at the beginning with the brain growth. And the point here, if you can see this is, and this is really amazing, and most people don't really understand this as I talk to people, that 90% of your brain development, which is about your cognitive abilities, takes place by the time you're 5 years old. Think about that. Look even younger, it's 85% by the time you're 3. Right? It's 70% by the time you're 1. So by the time a student gets to kindergarten, to your point, by the time a student gets to kindergarten, they're pretty much cooked in terms of their cognitive abilities. And it's true, and we've seen this over time, that high school can't fix it, college can't fix it. It's really those first 5 years of life. So let's look at the next one. This is about brain neurons and synapses and how those literally develop. So, this is what it looks like on the left at birth, and this is what it looks like at 3 years when it sort of maxes out. It's sort of maxed out at 3 years, and then we begin to prune. So we build them all as very young kids. You come into the world, your brain is just a sponge. You soak it up, you start making all these connections, or don't, and we'll come back to that in a second. And then you start to prune, and I actually hate to think what all of us in the room, I'll start with myself, actually look like now. I'm worried I have just one left. But it's really true, isn't it, right? It's like you need more help all the time. But at any rate, it peaks at this incredibly young age. And so again, this is why, getting kids at their earliest time matters. Now, let's go forward, and I'm assuming people have heard about this, but let's just talk about it for a second for those of you who haven't, which is what has now become famously known as the 30 million word gap. And what this is saying is that as kids, their brains develop, and as kids are forming these synapses, it matters how they're stimulated. And kids in affluent families are being stimulated, their brains are being stimulated more because they're hearing in part more words. And it's not more words as in different words, so that's partly also true. It's just more words. It turns out that that affluent families, because of the way they're interacting with their kids and some of the experiences they give them, actually talk to their kids more than less affluent families. And researchers have now figured out that by the time that it gets to be 4 years old, that kids in affluent families have heard 30 million more words in their brains than less affluent kids, and that amount of input, that amount of stimulation matters. This is looking again at the critical period for learning language, and it gets back to the idea that the brain is a sponge. So if you look at this, you can see that kids are born with the ability to learn multiple languages. Research now shows that in the first year of life they get almost anything in any language you can speak to them in, and they sort of get it. But it declines over time, right? And it declines pretty quickly. So by the time you're past 7, it begins to really fall off. By the time you get to be 17, the ability to learn a second language has really tapered off from what it was when you were younger. And then finally, this is plotting effort versus ability to change. So what you're seeing here on the left is when you're born, your brain, again, is this sponge that has almost this infinite capacity to change in response to the environment and learn that second language. It's very easy for it to do. But as those synapses form and begin to prune, it becomes harder and harder. And so the amount of effort that it takes to actually overcome experience and change by experience really increases over time. So the brain is most able to take it in when you're young, and as that ability declines as you get older, it becomes harder and more effort has to go in. So what does all this add up to? Well, let's talk about one other thing in addition to the 30 million word gap, which is important. But there's another thing that really matters, and that is the level of stress that a kid experiences early in their life. So if a kid experiences toxic stress, and they're doing more work on this all the time, and this was really sort of very frightening to me when I was first shown this, and I was looking at MRIs that they're now doing of brains. And if you look at the MRIs of brains of kids who have been under different levels of stress, what you see is that kids who have been exposed to what is sort of called toxic stress, early in life, their brains actually don't grow as big. They're literally smaller. So if you think about the equality of opportunity, and we all start with sort of, the same chance in life, if you're under this kind of toxic stress, you are not do not have the same opportunity in life because your brain literally isn't going to grow as big. So what is toxic stress? Well, it results from a variety of things, but a lot of it is poverty related. Almost half the kids less than 6 in this country now live in poverty, and poverty provides the kind of unfortunate area and conditions, I guess is what I'm trying to say, for these kinds of stress events to happen. And what are they? Well, some of the big ones are abuse, but it can also be drug abuse by parents, neglect. It can be traumatic divorce. It can be incarceration of family members. It can be a range of things. It can be depression on the part of a parent. So if you have one of those conditions, and it turns out that 25% of kids in poverty have one or more of these, then your brain literally isn't going to grow as big. So all this, sort of gets to the point, if I could make the statement, if you remember Wordsworth's famous poem of a couple hundred years ago, when he said, "The child is the father of the man." I guess we at Sesame would say that the child is also the mother of the woman. But the point is that if you give us the child, we'll give you the adult. And if things don't happen in those first 5 years of life, you can almost never catch up. So let me leave one other thought. How am I doing in time? Am I okay in time?
You're doing okay.
Okay. Let me one other thought, because this to me is one of the reasons I really joined Sesame, and what are we trying to do here for this group of sort of business leaders. Because I do believe that a lot of people think about this in moral terms, and there is no question about the morality of this. It's just simply unfair to be born to the Lucky Sperm Club, or the right zip code, or the right parents, or whatever it is. But let's really talk about this in economic terms. And I really do believe that our country is going to really come into a very bad way here based on the collision of two incredible trends. The first, which was alluded to before, was the aging of America. And the second is what's going on as a result of this, and kids not actually being ready in that first 5 years of life for what lies ahead. So let's connect them real quickly. Mankind's been on the earth, 6 million years, 2,000 years at least in the form we sort of know it in this room. The average lifespan of an American male 100 years ago, 1900, was 47 years. Think about that, 47 years. It's almost doubled in the last 100 years. 100 years in the history of mankind is a blink of an eye, really. And as a result of that, we are not ready, right? People haven't saved enough. Society hasn't saved enough. We are just not ready for what is coming, which is for the first time, the oldest segment of society that is going to live longer, and without the financial resources to do it. So how's that going to work when people haven't saved? Well, it's going to, I don't think the answer is, to tax businesses, to pay for it, because that number won't work. And it's not going to be about the 1%, because that number won't work. It's really going to have to be about the condition of the economy. And we're going to need a really robust economy. And a really robust economy requires a very educated workforce. So let's talk about some other statistics. As a result of what we just showed, 64% of kids in this country, by the time they're in the 4th grade, cannot read at grade level. Think about that, 64%. But that number gets to 80% when you talk about kids of color. African American kids and Hispanic kids cannot read at 4th grade level. By the time they're in the 4th grade, that number is 80%. So that is a very bleak prognosticator for the kind of economy we're going to need to make this all work. So you're going to have the intersection of two trends if we don't do something about this. We're going to have the intersection of a completely uneducated workforce at the level we need it, at a time when society is never going to need a more robust economy to pay for the living conditions of a group that is going to live longer and longer. And those two are going to collide in a very bad way if we do not do something about this.
Thank you, Jeff. I want to just underscore here what just happened. So the Alliance makes investments around advocacy and policy for early childhood. So we invest in the Center on the Developing Child at Harvard, who did the work on toxic stress. So we pay a lot for that, and to have that research undergird the advocacy, because you only want to advocate on things that make a difference and that are going to get the right result. And we have a lot of times where Jack Shonkoff, who's a pediatrician by trade and who is a researcher and a policy guy, gets on the stump and talks about that stuff. But what we just saw was a CEO of a huge corporation, and we could put you on the stump instead of Jack Shonkoff, and we may do that, Jeff, because not only does he get it and he understands it, but he articulates how that has meaning in what he sees in his everyday world. So I just want to underscore how incredible that really is. So I thank you for that. I'm going to introduce Linda Smith, who I have known for many years as a wonderful colleague and friend, and I have to put my glasses on to read her title no matter how many years I've known her, because it doesn't fit on a business card, but you know, and I'll jumble the words if I don't, which is embarrassing. So Linda officially is the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Early Childhood Development for the Administration of Children and Families at the United States Department of Health and Human Services. I know her as Linda, and you all soon will too. Linda has been a champion for children for many years in many different capacities, and she can share some of those if she'd like. Linda, I think it really might be incredibly informative if you will talk about how you see the best bets to closing this gap that Jeff laid out for us. And I think there's another gap maybe that you could touch on, and that's the gap between all of that good research and science and what we know, and then in policy sometimes what we're able to do.
All right. Well, thank you, Lisa, and thank you for CED for having this panel. I think it's a huge step forward for our country to be having this discussion in front of this group of people, and I applaud CED for doing that. I want to start out by thanking Jeff for setting the stage so well on the science, and also if George Barrett is still in the room, see me afterwards. I want to put him on the road too, as his comments on social emotional development of children were extremely important. And they're the one piece that we often fail to talk about. It sort of comes along with the toxic stress issue, but children who are not well adjusted socially, emotionally at age 3 and 4 are really on a pathway to not succeeding later on. And we've had many conversations about the expulsion of children 3 years old out of our preschools for this very issue. So I think we have to say that. The other piece of that is that if you look at the neuroscience, the cognitive part of our learning, the math and the science and so forth, to get to that, it travels through the part of the brain that controls our social and emotional well-being. So we can't isolate children and just say we're going to now teach them and they're going to be okay. It's more complicated than that. I want to go back to Lisa's question now and just say one thing. One of the things, and there is a big gap in this country, and I want to point out, one of the things that didn't get said is I started out and spent 25 years working in the Defense Department. And we really redesigned the early childhood system in DOD. And why did we do that? And it wasn't because we were, for some of us working on it, we were altruistic. But it wasn't that the leadership necessarily was. What they got in defense and what our country has yet to totally embrace is that back in the 80s, we understood in the military that we recruited roughly half of those coming into the military were coming out of military families. And so if we didn't do it right in the early years, we were paying a price when they were recruited into the military, and people were having to train and retrain them. So it was pretty simple investment on DOD's part, is to get it right to the extent that we could. And they invested early on and heavily, and that has produced a good system. And I think that's one of the things our country is going to have to deal with here, is this public investment to get us where we need to go with the rest of the population. So what are we really struggling with in this country? And we're struggling with what we in the administration call a twofer. We need access to quality programs, and it's both access and quality that we need. We cannot separate those things. For many years in this country, it's been, okay, put children wherever we can find, warehouse them, that when their parents pick them up, all is well. Well, it's a fact in our country that roughly 12 million children on a weekly basis are in some form of non-parental child care. And the quality of that care is very, very erratic. And so we really have got to look at this. And I have said forever that for those 12 million children, like it or not, that is where they're getting their early education. So we really have got to deal with the whole system. It isn't just pre-K, it's not just one thing or the other. It has to be, as Jeffrey said and pointed out, it has to be birth to 5, it has to be all settings, all children. It simply, we cannot slice and dice this and come up with a successful end product here. So how do we get to quality in early childhood education? And that's where we are stuck right now. In fact, the quality of early childhood, whether it's childcare, pre-K, Head Start, or no matter where it is, depends on the quality of the adults who are working with those children. And that's where we have a problem, because we have a very unskilled, uneducated, untrained workforce, for the most part, who are poorly paid and are struggling to just make ends meet. And when I say poorly paid, in many, many places in this country, the average hourly wage for a person working in childcare is less than $10 an hour. So what are we doing about this? So how do we expect to get high quality educated people when we're paying that money, that wage? Well, we can't. I mean, that's a reality. So what does it cost to do it well? Well, if you look here in the Washington, D.C. area, there is high quality childcare and early education available. What does it cost? About $20,000 a year here in the district. Now, if you are a minimum wage worker and you're making $10 an hour, do the math. You cannot afford to put your children in the programs that you work in this country, and that's true for most of childcare around this country. So we really have got to deal with this wage. And how do we do it? Because parents cannot, I repeat, cannot pay any more than they're already paying for this. So what we have is a problem where we've got a situation where the market really, what it costs to produce a product, which is high quality early care and education, costs more than the consumers, for the most part, can afford to pay. So how do we begin to think about the gap between what parents can pay? We're not suggesting that it should be free, but it does need to be affordable to our families. And how do we begin to address that gap? I'm going to give you a quick little math thing that we do at HHS that sort of sets the stage for one of the solutions that we are working on. And that is, we at the department fund the Child Care and Development Block Grant, the money that goes out to the states to pay for child care. On average, across the states, and this is a block grant, and this is up to the states how much they pay, they are paying, on average, for an infant, $5,500. That's the value of the subsidy that a family gets. Now, compare that to the $20,000 that it costs for a high-quality program here in Washington, for example. But more than that, even compare that to what we pay for Head Start, which is essentially about 2.5 times that to get to what we are trying to do with our Head Start families. So I do the quick and dirty math. If you, in early childhood, the ratio of children to adults is usually 1 to 4. That's pretty standard across the country. If you do the $5,500 times 4, and just say that's what that particular provider is going to be making, what is that? It's roughly $22,000 a year that we're paying to care for 4 infants. Go back to the brain science. That's what we're getting. That's what we're paying. Now, can anyone in this room think that they can provide a high-quality service to 4 infants on that amount of money when they're trying to pay for food, pay for equipment, pay for all of the things that go along with that? That, my friends, is poverty wages right there. And that's where our workforce is. So we have been looking at the gap and how do we begin to close this gap so that we can pay these people more and in turn require more of them in terms of their training and education levels. And through what we call the Early Head Start Child Care Partnerships, which has been a big test of this administration over the last 2 years, we put out roughly $500 million to 275 grantees. And what we are doing through those partnerships is we are paying Head Start to partner with a child care provider and roughly double the amount of money they're receiving through the partnerships. And we are seeing all over this country improvements in the quality of child care as a result of that. It's really demonstrating that if we pay people enough money and fund the equipment and the support, they will do the work and they can do the work. And so what we've got, though, is we cannot, from the federal level, do grants for all of the infant, toddler, birth to 3 child care we need in this country. It's literally impossible. We could not manage that. So the next issue is how do we then get enough money in the system to close that gap in the states? And that's where we're struggling. We're looking at this. We've got a number of things. We introduced, Senator Casey introduced legislation for us this last spring to try and close that gap, and it roughly means doubling the size of the block grant that we have going to the states, and in return for that, requiring the states to do the things to train the workforce, get them the equipment, and give them the support they need to do the job right. So that gap is really where we are. I want to close with one thought. Secretary Sebelius used to close her remarks saying one thing about early childhood, and I think it bears some relevance to this conversation. In China, they have set a goal of having more people in their country with a bachelor's degree than we have citizens in the United States. Now, when you think about that, think down the road to can we afford to lose one little life and have one of our citizens, not producing? We really can't, people. We really do have to deal with this.
Thank you, Linda. You can see Linda's passion and how lucky we are to have her sitting in HHS where she is sitting right now and leading this charge. So I'll underscore with all of Linda's math, and this is a good business economic audience, so you're good about math, the fact that this sounds like, in some ways, a lot of money. The braiding, it is no small task in any government to braid funding streams. So when you hear child care and Head Start being braided, note how incredible that is. But yesterday I had the opportunity to talk to the Council on Foundations, some of whom fund in early childhood and some of whom don't. So what struck me was this question. Lisa, we get the notion that a lot of you think it's really important to fund in the early years, and we don't do that, but we buy it, we understand it. But what happens once the early years are done and they go to kindergarten with my kid, and the kids that either don't get these quality programs Linda's talking about, or kids that don't get anything, enter school with my kid? And my kid is probably all of our kids, because we're all fortunate, and we're all giving our kids probably what they need in the early years. Some of them are home, and some of them are not home in those times, but they're getting what they need to get from us. And what I was struck by was the notion that they're holding back other kids in K, 1, 2, 3, et cetera, et cetera. So we're going to hear a little bit about cradle to career coming up. The answer was all boats need to rise. We don't want to worry about who's being held back. We want to worry about rising all boats, and then you don't have to worry about who's sitting next to who in the classroom. So I think let's turn to Larry. Larry Jensen is the president and CEO of Cushman and Wakefield, Commercial Advisors and Partners. Larry, it occurs to me that your commercial real estate puts you in, at least according to the friends I know, who talk about location, location, location in your business. In the policy world, there's a translation a little bit similar that would be all politics are local. And Larry has been leading some incredibly innovative work at the community level in Memphis. So would you please share some of that?
Thank you, Lisa. Leading would be a strong term. Participating, yes. Let me give you, I'm from Memphis, and we have a core county, Shelby County. It's part of a 3-state region. And so when I talk to you, I'm going to be talking to you about that core county. Within that county, on an annual basis, there's about 13 to 14,000 live births every year. It's been pretty steady for a long time. And of that, there's about a 47% poverty rate among those children. And the good news is that we have been in a initiative, Cradle to Career, since 2001. And I've got to get 15 years of history in 6 minutes. So it's Washington. I think I can do it. But today, and in the next 12 to 24 months, the 4-year-olds in our core county, there are 14,000 of them, as I said. 2/3 are eligible for some kind of pre-K, and 47% are in poverty. We will be within 1,700 children of having everybody in a quality pre-K program. This is a part of an effort that, as I said, has been going on for a number of years. There is a 23-point strategy that's been put together, and it covers from 0 to the 3rd grade on how to address the needs that we're talking about up here. In particular, this organization is called People First, and it has a 30-member board that's from across the community, educators, philanthropy, business. They've come together. They have, as I said, a 23-point strategy that they are in the midst of implementing and doing very well at it. There are stakeholders that are very much involved. And we talked about the adverse childhood experiences. That's the ACE. That's the toxic. And we've got about 10,000 kids in the county that are subject to that. About 4,000 that we know are really in the midst of that today. And so the outcome has been, it really started, and I'll briefly tell you that it was business leadership in 01 and 02 that really got this together. We created a thing called Memphis Tomorrow, which our friend Steve Odlin was the chairman of at the time when he was in Memphis. And he and I worked with the other folks on this initiative, and we set forth a series of goals that had to do with what's good for our community, and in particular the workforce question. In other words, these ladies and gentlemen were running businesses or institutions, and their concern came out of how do we create a workforce that's capable, but also just out of a tenderness and care, not losing another child. That we lost a generation of children, and what could we do as business leaders to address that? And what's happened is that, and I would just encourage the business leaders to understand this, you got to be patient, you got to listen, you got to engage at the grassroots of the community. You can't walk in and say, here's 5 things we're going to do, and we're going to do it next month. It's not going to happen. There has to be a servant approach to this from the business community, and a collaboration, a real sense of collaboration. There has to be, there's going to be hand-to-hand combat in the early days. We fought for, I guess, a couple of years, for example, for charter schools, and it was a very difficult process. And now in our city, I think we have. We've got, I think it's 19,000 children are in some charter school. We also have, over this time period, have been able, our high school graduation rate in 06 was 67%, and as of last spring, it's up to 75%. So we're making progress, but I would just encourage you to really think about how you bring your peer leaders together to say, what can we do together to come alongside the rest of the community to address these? And we've seen teacher scores starting to go up. The student scores are starting to rise. So I think we sort of feel like we're not there. I don't want to make it sound like that the work's well in front of us, but I think we're on a trajectory to really be able to have an impact on these kids. And again, we've got kids who are living in just the description of that. And somebody told me years ago that, if a kid doesn't learn to read by the third grade, they can't read to learn thereafter. And that's just, to me, that breaks my heart to think about a kid getting to the 3rd grade, and we know what happens. They go to the 4th grade, people start making fun of them in the 5th grade, and by the time they get to the 8th grade, look at your dropout rates in about the 7th or 8th grade. It looks like a rocket taking off. And those kids are going to go somewhere, and a lot of them go to gangs and alternative lifestyles that are not healthy for our communities. So I would encourage you to, Dr. James Heckman, who is at the University of Chicago, the Nobel laureate in economics, he's written on all of this. I mean, detailed on the economic impacts. The research is done. The outcomes are very definitely possible. And we've had a lot of attention because of this. We're being called Teacher Town, and the Bill and Melinda Gates have put $90 million into our community on the education. So it's been a good run so far. We're not there, but I would just encourage the business leadership to really think about how collaboratively you can come alongside the rest of the community.
Fantastic. Thank you, Larry. So Jim Heckman is another person in the Alliance Funds, but we're going to really start to think about how we do our return on investment and save some money and put some of you guys out there. This is just too good. Tom Lamb is the Senior Vice President of Government Affairs for PNC Financial Services Group. I know PNC from back in the day as one of, I think, the first corporations who has truly, truly embraced the idea of investing in our youngest children all across this country. So it's really fun to think about the local work that had been happening. All good policy is informed by those programs on the ground. Here are examples of what needs to happen. And if we do that, then we can inform good state policy. Things happen differently in different states. So Tom, you have a mammoth task of telling a little bit about the PNC story, which has been many years in the making. And it would probably be great if you could also share a little bit about how that looks different in different places.
Sure. Thank you. Many of you may be at least somewhat familiar with the PNC Grow Up Great program. One of our great partners is sitting right here in the middle of the panel, the Sesame Workshop. It is now a 12-year-old initiative. It started in right around now, April, the month of the early child in 2004. It is a $350 million multi-year bilingual initiative focused on children 0 to 5 to help prepare them for school. To date, Grow Up Great has served 2.6 million children. The program really began in the early 2000s when our CEO at the time, Jim Rohr, asked what maybe sounded like a fairly simple question at the time, but he said, can we make a bigger impact if we focus a meaningful portion of our philanthropy in one specific area of need in the community? PNC, like many companies, had a long history of philanthropic and human engagement in the communities that we serve, but now this was a little bit of a new dimension. We were, like most, giving money to a wide range of entities within our communities, but what if we focused in one area, and if we did, what would that be? And so we asked our employees, what do you think of this? And our employees came back and said, well, if we're going to do this, we should focus either on children or education, or in some way an integration of those two thoughts. We had already had, as a corporation, some engagement in early childhood education initiatives in Pennsylvania and locally in Pittsburgh and a couple of our other markets. So we knew a little bit about it. But right around that same time was when Art Rolnick at the Minneapolis Fed, Jim Heckman at the University of Chicago, some of the folks at Brookings were really starting to roll out the early research papers on return on investment. As bankers, we really aren't positioned to articulate educational theory. Doesn't work all that well. But we do know something about return on investment. And so this idea of return on investment really was something that kind of captured our thinking. And so we began to think more clearly about what we want to do, and it kind of laid the foundation for how we began to figure out what we were going to do. And so there were several decisions we made early. We knew next to nothing about early education. And for this to work, it had to be about more than just our making monetary grants. No company or group of companies could move the needle on this issue by itself, and the program had to engage our employees in some way. And since we understood the magnitude of what we didn't know, one of the first things we did was reach out to people who knew a lot more about it, and that included the folks at Sesame Workshop, the folks at the Fred Rogers Company, who we knew very well from Pittsburgh, National Head Start Association, and then we began to identify experts around the PNC footprint who could help guide and inform our thinking. And so we created an advisory council composed of people like Steve Barnett at the National Institute of Early Education Research, and Barbara Bowman in Chicago, and Sharon Darling in Louisville, Kentucky, and the list goes on and on. And from that, we created a program that really has 4 pieces to it. It has a grants piece, and to date we have made grants in excess of $105 million. It has a volunteerism piece, and to date 52,000 employees have volunteered in one way or another in Grow Up Great programs, 570,000 hours of volunteer time. We do provide 40 hours of paid time off to every employee to volunteer in a Grow Up Great environment.
I'm sorry, you only have like another minute and a half, but could you really repeat that last comment, please?
So every employee is entitled to 40 hours of paid time off. That has resulted in 575,000 hours of volunteerism. We have an awareness campaign, and then finally, to my earlier point where we said no one company could move the needle, the final component to what we put a lot of emphasis on at Grow Up Great and the PNC is the advocacy side. And so we have engaged our executives not only at the corporate level in Pittsburgh, but in all of the 35 markets that PNC serves. Our regional presidents, our heads of commercial banking, corporate banking, retail banking, whatever, are engaged in both volunteerism and advocacy. And we have seen a lot of progress in 12 years. We have states that were contributing nothing to early ed 12 years ago that are now devoting hundreds of millions of dollars, and we've been able to protect that money as state budgets have struggled. We have a long way to go. We still have states that aren't where they need to be, but we have seen business, and I'll point out one thing in my last couple seconds. If no one has ever seen what's going on in Alabama with the Business Council of Alabama or heard Billy Canary, if there's one example of what business can do in a short period of time, it is Billy Canary, Montgomery, Alabama.
Thank you. Amen to that. So, the early childhood business is all about relationships, relationship between a newborn and a parent, relationship between a caregiver and a teacher and a young child and a student, all kinds of relationships. So I'll just tell you, Tom, that PNC has been so instrumental in the work that they are doing in this area that I personally and everyone I know has opened accounts at PNC because that's just the way it ought to be. So I want to spend literally the next, when you talk about lightning rod, you each like literally less than a minute, but we want to open it up to audience questions, so I'm going to take proxy and ask the first one. And you all can go in any order you want. But the question is, I always feel like you should end with a charge, lead the charge and give a charge for others as they walk out the door. So the question is, what is the one thing, pick one thing that you would ask your colleagues to do now? And Linda, if you want, you can talk about business, public-private partnership in that way. But whoever wants to start, what is one thing that you want to charge your peers to do?
Well, I'll make one comment, and this is on the advocacy side. Every business should reach out to the advocacy organization in their state capital. They're all looking for business leaders to help them on their engagement. It delivers the message at a completely different level than they are able to do on their own. But every state capital has an organization like this, and they're desperately looking for business leaders to engage.
Amen to that. And if you don't know the statewide advocate that's working on early childhood in your state, go to w's.earlysuccess.org and the Alliance will be happy to help you with that.
I think I jump in on what was just said and say that early childhood needs businesses' voice. And I want to just back up and say one thing that I didn't mention earlier. Early childhood, even in this polarized city that we're sitting in right now, it is the one issue that there is broad-based bipartisan support for. And in this last go-around of the budget, we got over $1 billion in new money in early childhood. So it is not, sort of the lightning rod issue right now that people get polarized over. People, in fact, are trying to work together to figure this out. So I think if you jump in to both the state and the federal level, you get the ears of people that the early childhood advocacy community just can't get to. And I think your voice would be heard, and it would probably surprise some people. And so I think getting you engaged and getting you to talk to folks about what are we going to do about this problem is a really important thing that I would add.
So I guess I'd ask people to think outside the box and say, what can I do in my business to help the 30 million word gap? There's one of the things that they now understand. I did some research, I think it was at Rutgers, with supermarkets, and they found if you put signs inside supermarkets in low-income areas that said, "Have you talked to your kid today?" and then put signs in the vegetable department saying, "Have you counted the vegetables?" or talked about where fruit comes from or whatever, families start to talk to their kids in whole new ways. And they found out that those supermarket interactions started to look in poor areas like they did in affluent areas. And it cost about $60 worth of signs. So I would say to every executive here, if you're in a B2C environment where you're actually dealing with consumers and families, is there something we can do in the way we interact with kids and families that will make low-income families, help them out, and get them to understand what a difference it makes to stimulate the brains of these kids by the time they're 5 years old?
I would say that this is abstract in a way, very abstract when we hear the numbers and all that. But I tell you, if you go to one of these early childhood or a Boys and Girls Club or somewhere like that and just go see it, and I think it causes compassion. If you have a heart, the compassion will rise up on the inside and you go, we can't lose any more of these children. And I do think that's, that would be a charge I'd encourage people to just go find somewhere. I guarantee it's not far from where you live.
Please join me in thanking this amazing panel. So we have time for a few questions.
Hi, I'm Sean Glass, a member of CED. One question I have when you think about the gap is how might you best think about applying technology? Sorry. Question was, when you talk about that funding gap, so one way is to create more funding, the other way is to think about more efficiency, and so how would you think about bringing technology into closing that dollar gap?
We've actually thought about that a little bit, and I think the place for technology in early childhood to in the gap situation is in the workforce, and how do we train them, and how do we make the appropriate training and courses available to them that gets them what we need them to have. And I think technology plays a really important role in that, especially in our rural areas where where people don't have access to a community college, or the correct, the classes that they need to get it. I think that's one of the most important things that we could do right now to support the workforce.
So I guess I'd chime in that and say the following, that Sesame is the most tested television program in the history of television, and we know that kids that watch Sesame when they're in preschool do better at every level of education, and by the time they get to be high school and college, they actually do 16% better in grades, the kids that watch versus the kids that didn't watch. And the amazing thing about this, and it was, back in the day, Joan Gans Cooney was trying to use the medium of the time, but the great thing about television was that it bypassed the local school districts in a way. And it didn't get caught up in the politics. It didn't get caught up in zip codes. It just went direct to the consumer. And I think technology has the opportunity to do that again. And I think, I'm spending more time with the people out in Silicon Valley, and one of the things that they start to think about this problem, and it is about local school districts and how do they think about it. And so the question becomes, how do we do it again in new medium to go direct to the consumer? So we are spending a lot of time thinking about, we are starting to partner now with some of the best technology companies in the world to think about adaptive learning. How do we really take the skills that these companies have, put it with the skills that we have in terms of how do you talk to kids in education, all the rest of it, and come up with a better way to adapt learning to the engagement and the capabilities of each kid. Because the holy grail, where Sesame was wonderful, it reached all these kids. Where it wasn't so wonderful, they all got the same thing. So the question is, can we adapt it to the individual capabilities and engagement? Because if you can't reach, you can't preach. So we got to figure out how to engage each kid. So we're spending a tremendous amount of time and energy, and you'll hear more about that actually in the next couple of months. Announcements will be made. But how do we do that to take the technology of today and bend it to help this problem?
Thank you. Maybe one last question?
Go ahead.
You're the first. So.
I'm Kathleen Mystery, and I just want to follow up on the Boys and Girls Club issue. At our Homeowners Association meeting, the Reston, Virginia Police Department reported a great decrease in gang activity when the corporates were funding the Boys and Girls Club's after-school programs. I don't know if that's around the country or not.
I can speak with some knowledge of that. The Boys and Girls Club in our city tracks their high school graduation rate, and it's up in the 90 percentile. And they say if they get a kid in their program for 5 years, and we've got a ton of other organizations very similar, that they will likely graduate from high school. What's interesting is if you go to our jail, 95% of the guys in the jail are African American and do not have a high school education. So, there's a correlation there, but again, it's getting to the kids and giving them some hope and some vision. It's not just an education; it's also you can be something, and I'm going to stand with you and go with you in this process to get there. So, and I think that's what Boys and Girls Club and other organizations like that do, is they give a kid a sense of hope and value.
We know there's more questions, and I'm afraid there's not time, but this is what I always like to do. If you will just make sure you find whoever you want to ask and hopefully be able to snag them before the end of the day, and at the very least, give your questions to one of the CED folk, because they then could get to these folk and get you answers. Again, thanks to the panel. Thank you all very much.